Good afternoon and welcome to the Miles Nadal JCC. My name is Lisa Roy. I'm the manager of Adult Daytime Culture and Education at the Miles Nadal Jewish Community Center located in downtown Toronto. It is wonderful to see familiar faces back in our building, and I want to extend a special hello to our at-home virtual audience. It is my pleasure to be hosting this afternoon's lecture, The Art of Passover, with art historian Nancy Kotz. Today's program is generously supported by JAE, Jewish Art Education, and is supported by a Resilient Communities Fund grant from the Ontario Trillium Foundation. I am so grateful to our JCC technical staff, Peter Fellhaber, Jake Rolls, Patrick Lemieux, Ariel Reutman, and Tiffany Yaw, who's here in the room with us today, for their support of this hybrid event. And a special thank you to my wonderful JCC colleagues, Deanna DiLello, who is hosting our Zoom room, and McElraith, who is here in the room with us, and our volunteer, Carolyn Burns, for their assistance. A reminder, if you're in the room, to please turn your cell phones to vibrate or to off. And if you have a question for Nancy, either here or in our Zoom room, she will answer them at the end of her lecture. And now it gives me very great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Nancy Kotz, who is joining us virtually from the Washington area, began her career in arts and public policy with the Congressional Arts Caucus before transitioning to the museum world, where she held positions in museum education and retail at the Smithsonian Institute and National Gallery of Art. Nancy is also the founder and content curator for Visual Arts DC, a social media-based community with over 1,500 followers. Since 2015, through Jewish Art Education, JAE, Nancy has presented in-person and virtual programs to audiences across Maryland, the District of Columbia, and Virginia, and we are so fortunate to have her joining us today. Please join me in a very warm JCC welcome for Nancy Kotz.
Thank you so much, Lisa, and thank you to the Miles Nadal JCC in Toronto. This is Canada Week for me. I'm going to be presenting to a JCC in Vancouver tomorrow. So give me just a moment to bring up my slides. Okay, and I'm going to do just a couple of technical things for your viewing pleasure. I'm going to hide the video panel as well as the floating controls. So all that will be visible on the screen will be the images I'm going to show. So I'll take care of that. And we'll get started. So Jewish Art Education is a not-for-profit organization whose mission is to bring an awareness of the visual arts of the Jewish world to the wider world. And today we are going to do that by looking at art related to the holiday of Passover. And I heard several folks in the Zoom room talking about being very busy with Passover preparations, and you had my mouth watering. Of course, Passover runs from the 15th to the 22nd of the Hebrew month of Nisan. And we will begin our celebrations this year in the common calendar or Gregorian calendar on the evening of April the 5th. The Torah instructs us to celebrate Passover for 7 days, but Jews outside of Israel in the diaspora lived too far away to receive word as to when to begin their observances. Thus, an additional day of celebration was added to be on the safe side and not to celebrate on the wrong day. The story begins in Egypt, when the Pharaoh issued an edict to kill all of the Jewish baby boys. There was a Jewish baby named Moses, whose sister Miriam put him in a basket and placed him in the river, where she knew that Pharaoh's daughter came to bathe. Miriam was correct, and Moses was taken to the royal palace and raised in the Pharaoh's house. Years later, he became very powerful in Egypt. When he realized that Jews were slaves there, he became incensed, especially when he saw a Jewish slave being beaten and killed by an overseer. So he used his position in the royal household and went to Pharaoh and asked him to let the Jews go. But Pharaoh wavered in his decision. One plague after another was sent to soften Pharaoh's heart. And I can't help but thinking about dipping my pinky in my wine glass when I go through the list. So first the rivers turned to blood and all of the fish died. Then frogs, lice, flies, disease, boils, hail, locusts, darkness descended one by one on the Egyptians. And finally, the 10th plague, the killing of the firstborn, sealed the deal. For the last plague, the Jews placed blood on their doorposts. Thus, their homes were passed over during the last plague. This is the origin for the name of the holiday of Passover, not asking someone to pass over the mashed potatoes. The 10 plagues are recognized worldwide by Jews, Christians, and Muslims. Modern and progressive Jews often participate in a Seder, even though they do not observe other Jewish holidays. The word Seder translates from Hebrew to English to mean order, and it is the order of using specific foods to tell the story of the Exodus. Finally, Pharaoh allowed the Jews to leave Egypt. It was on the night of the 15th of Nisan. Thus today we remember our slavery and celebrate our freedom during the holiday of Passover. Various Seders have become popular over the time, like women's Seders, labor Seders, and interdenominational ones. And interdenominational Seders are what my family used to always enjoy. We would always invite non-Jewish friends over to participate. The Passover is one of 3 pilgrimage festivals or harvest festivals, and it is known as the Festival of Freedom. It commemorates the redemption of the Israelite slaves from Egypt and points ahead to the redemption of the world and brings hope for the coming of the Messiah or the Messianic age. The holiday lasts for 8 days, as I mentioned earlier, and 7 in Israel. And it begins with a Seder on the night of the 15th, which celebrates the Exodus. And pardon my telephone, I think it has stopped. I'd like, before we begin, to just make mention of the founder of Jewish art education, Myrna Tech, because it is through her hard work and scholarship that I have all of the images I'm going to show to you today, as well as all of the wonderful information I have to tell you about those images. While there are many biblical citations that deal with the story of Passover and the Exodus, this particular one from the book of Exodus, chapter 12, verses 10 through 14, is among the earliest references in the Torah or Hebrew Bible. And it highlights how and why we shall eat. And of course, many of you are getting these Passover symbols ready to adorn the center of your Seder table. We have the roasted egg, which is a symbol of the temple sacrifice. 2 different bitter herbs that symbolize the bitterness of enslavement. My personal favorite, haroset, which is a mixture of fruit and wine that is reminiscent of the mortar used for the bricks that the Israelite slaves used to build Pharaoh's structures. Karpas, or spring greens, because the holiday does fall during springtime, but we dip those karpas or spring greens in salt water, again, a reminder of slavery. And the zaroa, or roasted shank bone, which is a symbol of the Paschal lamb, the animal that was used for the sacrifice for the Jews to mark their doorposts. Some innovative Jews include a variety of other symbolic foods, and I have a list about 10 of them here, and I'll just hit some of the highlights. Some of my favorites include fair trade chocolate, coffee, and cocoa beans to shine light on forced child labor in the chocolate and coffee industries. cashews that were used during the Iraq War to honor the soldiers there, olives, which are a symbol of hope for future peace between the Israelis and Palestinians, and my personal favorite, a food desert Seder plate to remind us of the lack of access to fresh, healthy foods in low-income neighborhoods. And of course, we cannot forget the food stuff that we see down there on the bottom right, the matzah, which is a symbol of the unleavened bread made by the Israelites as they left Egypt in haste without time for their bread to rise. So now I'd like to take you all back to the 3rd century to a site that is in present-day Syria that was known as Duraeuropas. And this is the Torah niche and walls from the synagogue at that site. These are the earliest known visual images of Exodus. Duraeuropas was a fortified caravan town located in the eastern frontier of a Persian empire. The town name Duraeuropas means fortress of Europas, and it was the name of the village where the emperor lived. Persians conquered the town and destroyed Duraeuropas in 256 CE. Survivors were deported and the city of Durye disappeared. These wonderful wall paintings, however, were preserved because people piled mounds of dirt against the walls to defend their town. And the result was that the west wall of this structure was preserved for archaeologists who discovered them in 1920. This area is now in Syria, and many different religions have lived there, including the Jews. The synagogue was located adjacent to the walls of the town. So here is one of several images we're going to look at from Duraeuropas. This image has been identified as Moses. During the 3rd and 4th century, architectural decoration was transferred from the facade of buildings to their interior. This was common to all, quote, Oriental countries of the empire. And Oriental here, and in those days, referred to places in the Middle East. As a result of this transfer of images to the interior of structures, rich epigraphical material has been excavated. The Jewish community was a strongly Hellenized one. Only the Roman-style military attire shows Roman influence here. The Greek influence remained dominant despite Roman occupation. The Greek influence was toward universal symbolization, while the Romans were interested in individualization and perspective, or the illusion of 3D space. So this next image from Duraeuropas shows Moses as a baby in the river. The image is complete with the bulrush basket and Pharaoh's daughter rescuing him. The image, however, is devised as a visual continuum. So on the shore, we see Miriam and her mother getting ready to put the baby boy in the basket. And then in the river, we see Pharaoh's daughter taking him out of the basket. We can tell that's her because she is unclothed since she is taking a bath. And this next image shows Moses leaving Egypt. In the wall painting, the adult Moses leads the Israelite slaves out of Egypt. He is shown as twice the size of the others and is enormous by comparison. His size is an indication of his great strength and power. On the left, the army is shown as they enter the water. And on the right are the Egyptians drowning in the Red Sea. Moses is the person going in front of his people as they move toward freedom. He walks through the dry sea opening. This is viewed under the open and guiding hands of God from above. Now, keep in mind those hands of God when we look at this next image, which is a set of pages from a Haggadah made in northern Germany that is known as the Bird's Head Haggadah, and this Haggadah was created in the 13th century. The pages that we are looking at have the words for Dayenu, or it would have been enough. And this is 1,000 years after Duraeuropas. Now the story is in the Haggadah, and the word Haggadah translates in English to the word telling. And the Haggadah is written in the present tense, as if we were living through the events that are described there. This is the earliest surviving illuminated German or Ashkenazi Haggadah. Rabbi Meyer of Rothenburg, who lived from 1215 to 1293, permitted two-dimensional figures as illustrations here, saying that they did not violate the second commandment as they were not concrete or graven. In other words, they were not three-dimensional. This image shows the Jews wearing pointed hats that were identified them as being from the Jewish community and were required during this time in Germany. This page depicts the Song Dayenu, sung at the end of the Seder. Notice the hands of God coming through the clouds on the bottom right, dropping foodstuffs or manna down to the Israelites, and on the left at the top, handing tablets to a figure in red, who then passes those tablets down to the figures below. And we might read that figure in red as an image of Moses receiving the 10 Commandments. Here we have another image from the Bird's Head Haggadah. This work has actually been republished in facsimile, and several years ago, my husband and I attended a Seder at Myrna Tech's home, and we used a facsimile of the Bird's Head Haggadah as one of the many Haggadot at the table. Here we see an image of a cantor who sings songs of praise and hallelujah. And this final image from the Bird's Head Haggadah today is one that shows the manufacturing of matzah, the unleavened bread for the Passover Seder. So from right to left, we see a figure with a basket full of dough, and then a figure using a fork-like implement to make holes in the dough so that it will be guaranteed not to rise. And then another central figure who passes the matzah, the round sheet of matzah, to an inspector at the end of the table. The process hasn't changed much over the past 800 years. Notice that these images of humanoid figures have birds' heads. We don't know why, but perhaps it is because birds fly free and Passover is a holiday of freedom. Our next Haggadah example is from 1320 and was made in Barcelona, and is known as the Golden Haggadah because of the beautiful gold backgrounds used in each of the images. It is an early sumptuous Spanish or Sephardic Haggadah from the 14th century. There are 14 pages of miniatures, a text, and 100 Passover piyutim or prayers. Passover preparations follow the depiction of biblical miniatures. Here is another set of those images. The background is decorated with patterned geometric designs. Miniatures are painted only on the flesh side of vellum, the skin of an unborn animal. It was highly prized for its smooth texture and lack of imperfections, so it was used as an early form of paper or canvas in this case. This Haggadah contains episodes from Adam to the Song of Miriam, from the books of Genesis and Exodus. The miniatures are divided into 4 frame panels or cells and read from right to left and top to bottom. And I'm going to show you a close-up of the one on the upper right. This is Miriam and the women, again from the Golden Haggadah made in Barcelona in 1320. The miniatures read from right to left and top to bottom, and the background is of burnished gold, which is how the volume got its moniker. And I would add that these figures are beautifully rendered, very elegant looking, their clothing, their delicate facial features and hair. And we should note that 1320, the 14th century, or Quattrocento, as the Italians would say, was at the beginning of the Renaissance. Not only is the Renaissance an art phenomenon that happened in Italy, but all over Europe. And we'd like to now compare that 13th century image to this 20th century image made by the artist Marc Chagall in 1931. This is moving forward in time, and we see Miriam and the women dancing with their timbrels. Miriam was the sister of Aaron, and the women followed her as she sang. This reference can be found in Exodus 15, verses 22 through 21. In this painting, Miriam dances, and it was created by Chagall in his naive, primitive style. His art is a combination of fantasy, folk art, and cubism. The next Haggadah that we're going to look at is called the Sarajevo Haggah, even though it was created in Spain in the 14th century. Back in the 14th century, the Sarajevo Haggah was the best-known Hebrew illuminated manuscript. It was reproduced twice in the last 75 years with scholarly introduction. The Haggadah and the Piyutim, or prayer texts, are heavily decorated. The first letter of the initial words has elaborate ascending and descending Gothic letters. The elongated letters extend to the margins of the 9 Haggadah images. They also include dragons and grotesqueries in the initial word panels and margins. And this was a typical thing for illuminated manuscripts in both the Christian as well as Jewish world. The story behind this Haggadah is that in 1894, a Bosnian Sephardi child brought a Hebrew book to school. His father had died and the family was destitute, and they needed to sell the heirloom for financial purposes. It somehow reached the National Bosnian Museum in Sarajevo, and that's how it got its name. The manuscript was probably brought to Italy from Spain in 1492 during the Spanish Inquisition. In 1609 in Italy, there is a censored mark that was added to the book by Giovanni Domenico Vistroni. So on the right, we see Moses holding the tablets at Mount Sinai, surrounded by the Israelites. And on the left, we see the stylized facade of the temple with its 3 gates. The middle gate has a conched ark, and inside is the Ark of the Covenant. On April the 16th of 1942, when the Nazis invaded Sarajevo, the museum's chief curator, an Islamic scholar, heard that the Nazis were looking for this particular book. They wanted it for their proposed museum of an extinct race. So the Islamic scholar hid the Haggadah in a mosque of a small nearby village until it was returned at the end of the war. So the Haggadah was saved by a brave Muslim. Our next page from a manuscript comes from a collection, actually, of manuscripts known as the Rothschild Miscellany. And this particular page shows searching for leavening and making matzah. The many of the images from the Rothschild Miscellany were culled together between 1450 and 1470. Jews came to Italy in the 2nd century BCE. In the 14th to 15th century, Jews flourished primarily from banking. In 1475, a charge of ritual murder was raised against the Jews of Trent. A miscellany contains religious texts, secular texts, and animal fables. This Haggadah is among those religious texts. And the image that we're looking at shows preparations for Passover. At the top, an elderly man hunts for chametz, or leavening, and we see him with his candle and his feather in front of a cupboard. Below him, we see 2 figures preparing the matzah dough. And at the bottom, we see 3 figures who are forming the matzah and putting it into the oven using a baker's peel. This book actually also has a World War II story associated with it. The Rothschild Miscellany got its name because the manuscripts included in it were owned by the very wealthy and famous Rothschild family. During World War I, the book had been in Paris, but it disappeared during the war. After the war, it was found in New York in the possession of the Jewish Theological Seminary. And once the State of Israel was established in 1948, and the subsequent Israel Museum was founded, the manuscripts were given to the Israel Museum in perpetuity. Our next Haggadah was one created in Prague in 1526. Johannes Gutenberg invented the printing press in Mainz, Germany between 1450 and 1454. He was originally from Strasbourg, and he received 2 loans from Jewish moneylenders to fund his invention. By 1475, Hebrew typefaces and books began coming off the presses. The manuscript form was retained in the early stages of Hebrew books, but space was left for initial words to be hand illuminated. And on the last page, colophons or publishers' emblems were made up of lines of gradually diminishing size. So the images that you see on the accompanying the text here were actually added after the text was run off the press, and those were done using the woodblock print technique. Early Jewish printers thought their work was a holy craft, and they did it with painstaking and loving care. The images that we see here are in a style of the German Renaissance, and it was a blend of Italian Renaissance and German Gothic style. Here we have medieval German lettering based on the finest scribal manuscript lettering of the period. And that became the prototype. This became the prototype for all printed Haggadot, I should say. This page begins the second part of the Seder after grace has been said. There is a picture of Elijah mounted on his donkey, and he is the announcer of the Messiah's approach. In the border is Samson carrying the gates of Gaza on the right, and on the left, Judith holds the head of Holofernes. On the top, we see Adam and Eve, and on the bottom, we see 2 figures who hold a heraldic shield with a rampant lion, the symbol of the Lion of Judah, the protector of the Jewish people. And if you look very closely, I've moved my mouse to the location. On the left-hand side at the bottom, between the shield and the figure, you see the Hebrew letter Shin. And this is the initial of the artist's name, Shahor. We just mentioned the Messiah coming to Jerusalem, and here is a view of Jerusalem with the Messiah entering from an Amsterdam Haggadah that dates to 723. At the end of the Passover Seder, we say next year in Jerusalem. This phrase implies that in Jerusalem, all of us will live together in peace. This is an 18th century view of the city as a medieval fortress. In this image, Elijah blows his horn to announce the coming of the Messiah, who will bring peace for everyone. Well, this is another image of a view of Jerusalem. This was made in the German region of Europe in the early 18th century. Note that King Solomon's temple is dead center of the city. The Norman-type forts for warfare are at the top of each building. The artist actually drew what was familiar to him, as he had never seen Jerusalem. And this is a Haggadah from Venice from 1609. And this is a folio that shows us the 10 plagues, as well as texts related to the plagues. These are the first composites of the stages of the Seder and the 10 plagues. And you'll notice down on the bottom right, there is a figure wearing a crown inside a big wash tub, and his body is speckled with some sort of condition. And I would imagine that that is a depiction of Pharaoh being tended to after the effects of one of the 10 plagues. On that side, we also see Moses to the right with the tablets. And on the left of that side of the page, we see Aaron wearing his breastplate. And of course, Aaron was Moses's brother. These images are all from what are known as Minhagim books, or books of customs. These books were made in each generation as a visual guide to the rituals and practices of the Jewish religion. And in all three of these, we see the activity of baking matzah. So on the top right is a woodcut from Venice from 1593. At the bottom right, we see baking matzah from a work made in Holland in 1699. And the larger image on the left is from 1768 and is also from the Netherlands. You'll notice that the process stays pretty standard in terms of the actual baking of the unleavened bread, but we see differences in the images in terms of their interior decoration and the costumes worn by the individuals depicted. These details help art historians place these images in their time period as well as their location. Bernard Picard gives us this image from 1725 called Searching for Leaven. Picard was actually not a Jewish artist. He was a French Calvinist who received a commission to do illustrations for a book titled The Ceremonies and Religious Customs of the Various Nations of the Known World. And so he traveled to Amsterdam, where he executed this project. And here he gives us these beautiful works by a French hand that show this preparation for the holiday of Passover. So on the right, we have a figure who is kneeling down with a feather and a plate and is brushing crumbs out of a cupboard into the plate and being assisted by someone who holds a candle so they can make sure they get every crumb. And in the center of the image, we see an adult female with two children, and they are inspecting what they have gathered. Further beyond, in the background of the scene, we see a figure who is shown through the window in bright light, who also looks as if they are cleaning their home for the holiday. Picard also gives us this image from this project to illustrate this mammoth undertaking of a book. And this is the Seder table. We notice there's a fire burning in the fireplace and a ceremonial holiday lamp burning over the table. And the figures seem to be reclining, which is traditional on Passover. Weighing and delivering matzah is the subject of this 1870s illustration made in Waltham, Massachusetts, for a publication called Leslie's Popular Monthly Magazine that was published by the American Jewish Historical Society. By the 19th century, matzah was made and sold in bakeries, but if you notice, it's still in that round shape. The familiar square shape that we all know and love didn't come about until the mechanization of the baking process, which happened during the Industrial Revolution and in the at the late 19th, early 20th century. However, here we do see bags of supplies there on the right, which are labeled in Hebrew or Yiddish, and a figure next to them who is weighing the matzah for each of the many customers at the door, while over on the left, we see baskets full and piles of matzah waiting to be purchased. This Passover scene by Maurice Oppenheim was made in 1882. Oppenheim's image of the Seder was frequently copied, and it depicts the pleasures of Biedermeier domesticity. The tension of assimilationist German nationalism is shown in contrast to Jewish tradition. So the figures that face us and are shown in the light wear contemporary costumes, but the figure who is in darkness and sits in the foreground with his back to us is clothed in traditional dress of a Hasid or Eastern European Jew. So this shows us that tension between assimilation and tradition. We jump ahead now to the early 20th century for this folio or page from L. Lizzitzki's Haggadah suite, produced in 1919. Haggadah is Hebrew for one little goat or kid. It is a cumulative song sung at the end of the Passover Seder. The song describes a goat consumed by a dog and other adversaries. And in the end, God destroys the final assailant, who is the angel of death. Lizzitzki was born Lazar Markovich in Smolensk, Russia. He was not admitted to the St. Petersburg Art Academy due to his being Jewish. He instead trained as an architect in Darmstadt. In 1916, he joined the Jewish Ethnographic Society, which financed expeditions along the Dnieper River to document the art and architecture of the wooden synagogues in that region. Lizzitzki created a modern Jewish style, and this style combined Jewish folk art with a modern art vocabulary. His art served both Jewish nationalism and the Russian Revolution. In fact, he was the artist who designed the flag carried in Red Square for the Revolution on May Day of 1918. This image is one of 10 illustrations from a Haggadah portfolio. It is not directly related to the text of the Haggadah. Haggadah is an allegory for the oppression of the Jewish people. It is an Aramaic poem based on a German ballad. Lizzitzki saw Haggadah as an allegory of survival, as well as the triumph of good and over evil. In 1919, he created this series in the year of the Bolshevik victory. This Haggadah page is one page of many illustrated by Ze'ev Rabin, and this was made in 1925 in Palestine. Rabin was born in Poland, the son of a merchant, and received a traditional Jewish and secular education. He studied art in his hometown of Lodz and in Munich, Paris, and Belgium. While in Paris, he met Boris Schatz, the founder of the Bezalel Academy of Art, and they met in 1906. Schatz hired Rabin to teach sculpture and anatomy at the school. Rabin became director of the repoussé department. Repoussé is a metalsmithing technique, which I'll talk about in more depth in just a moment. And Rabin also began to develop his own unique style. Rabin supported himself also by working on commission. In 1949, he designed tombstones for the soldiers of the Haganah, an elite defense group in Israel. As a student, Rabin saw the aesthetic styles of German Jugendstil and French Art Nouveau. Still, his passion for idealized Orientalism remained, emphasizing decorative patterns borrowed from exotic lands. So at the top of this Haggadah page, we see the Israelites leaving Egypt. We see a figure being led out on a camel, actually, as well as other figures. And then below on either side, we see scenes from the life of Jacob. So on the right, we have Jacob dreaming of the angels. And on the left, we have Jacob wrestling the angel. And we return to another image from our friend Marc Shutgall. This image was actually published posthumously after the artist died in 1985. So it was actually printed and published in 1987. But it is based on a series of etchings he originally made for an illustrated Bible that he created after he returned to France before World War II. He worked with a French publisher to create this Bible, and the images were all done in black and white etchings. Some of them, though, he later used for other purposes, like this one, which was used for a Haggadah. And here, the purpose of the page is to list out the order of the Seder. So notice we see Pharaoh seated over to the top right, a far distance away from Moses and Aaron, who are towards the bottom left-hand corner. And we can pick out Moses because of the karen or rays of light emanating from him. And we know Aaron by his colorful breastplate. Haggadot are something that the artisans at the Betzalel school in Israel are known for producing. This is a beautiful Haggadah cover done in that repoussé technique, where the metal is hammered from the back to create a relief image on the front. And it is also decorated with wonderful cabochon cut pieces of turquoise. Many of you may have seen these types of Haggadot and Seder covers. I know that both my sets of grandparents traveled to Israel in the 70s together and brought back copies of Haggadot and Seders for each of their children. So my family and all of my cousins' families. This work is one that is very well known. This is a work by Reuven Rubin, made in Israel in 1950, which he titled First Seder. Rubin was born in Romania and studied in Europe before emigrating to the land of Israel in 1922. His bright, expressive colors capture the optimism of the early settlers. Rubin became Israel's minister to Romania after the founding of the State of Israel in 1948. And in that capacity, he helped to arrange exit permits for many Romanian Jews. He painted his first Seder in Jerusalem in 1950. And the painting is a return to the style of his earlier years. The walls of the old city are visible through the arch on the right. A bearded man with a Seder plate is dressed as an Eastern European Hasid. Hasidism is a sect of Orthodox Judaism, which the word refers to piety. And they are the people who subscribe to this movement are identified by their dress, reflecting 17th century Polish nobility. Rubin pictures himself on the right, holding his son with his wife behind him. The other figures represent the various Jewish communities. And there are parallels in this work with The Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci. The three open arches are similar to da Vinci's open windows. Both paintings are symmetrical, and both paintings have 6 adults on either side of a central figure. A bright-robed man at the far left shows his palms facing up, portraying wounds. Clearly, Rubin intended this figure to represent Jesus. Rubin reminded the world that Jews suffered and died, but they rose again to life in their own land. Yet this is the first Seder, not the Last Supper. This dreamlike quality may be of a not yet arrived peaceful future. And this Haggadah page was illustrated by Ben Shahn in 1931. Shahn was born in Kovno, Lithuania, and came to the United States when he was 8 years old. Kovno was a center of socialism, and Shahn followed in his father's footsteps by becoming involved in social issues revolving around discrimination. Shahn apprenticed as a lithographer and also traveled extensively, finally settling in New York and then later Roosevelt, New Jersey. This Haggadah's elements are juxtaposed for maximum visual impact. They are not laid out in a traditional visual sequence. In this image, Moses has his staff upraised. He is confronting the serpent of Pharaoh's magicians. He is also confronting the last plague, the slaying of the firstborn. The artist uses flat color areas, decorative patterning, and shallow space. The Haggadah illustrates a fight against past oppression. Yet each generation is told to think that it is happening in our time. And this is one of Shahn's early works. It used a Jewish theme and his unique visual approach to calligraphy. Our next Haggadah is called the Survivors Haggadah and was made in Munich in 1946 to celebrate the first Passover after the Allied victory that April. This occurred in Munich, and the A insignia is that of the US Army of Occupation, or the Third Army of Bavaria, which used this insignia. The Haggadah was illustrated and written by 2 different survivors. Passover Seder by Arthur Chick was painted in 1948. Szyk was born in Lodz, Poland, and spent a brief time in Paris after World War I. In England at the beginning of World War II, he came to the United States in 1940, and he stayed here until the end of the war. Szyk produced political cartoons dealing with the Allied struggle and addressed the plight of Jews fleeing the Nazis. So here we see a Passover Seder scene, and the one thing I'd like to point out are the two children in the scene who represent two different phases of Judaism. So the little boy seen at the top of the image wearing traditional dress represents the old world, the Hasidic world. And the little girl down towards the foreground left with her blue dress and pink ribbons in her braids represents the assimilated child. Of course, we know that there are 4 children that we address during the Passover Seder, so these are probably just 2 of the 4. You'll notice that Szyk has a wonderful attention to detail. Notice the detail included on the fabric on the chair that the little girl sits in, as well as the carving on that chair, and the one occupied by the gentleman to the right, and also the beautifully rendered decoration on the pitcher and basin for washing your hands, as well as the oriental carpet. History of Matzah Part 1 was created by Larry Rivers as part of a 3-paneled work or triptych between 1982 and 1984. Larry Rivers was born Yitzhak Louisa Grossberg in New York City in 1923. Originally, he studied music and was a professional jazz saxophonist before turning to art. So that might explain why he changed his name to Larry Rivers. Rivers presents the power of matzah as a symbol. The triptych is acrylic on canvas, and matzah stands for more than the exodus from Egypt. It signifies the plight of Jews throughout the ages, and the fleeing in haste from place to survive. And you can see that Rivers also gives nods to art historical images in this work as well, with a depiction of Leonardo's Last Supper down on the right. Over on the left in the foreground, we see Michelangelo's David, here used in the proper context. And then at the top on the right, we see a frieze of Greco-Roman figures. And on the left, we see Egyptian-style figures. We also see on the left a figure holding a tablet over his head who may represent Moses. Our next image is by David Moss. And this was created in 1987 as part of a commission he received to do a custom commissioned Haggadah for Richard and Beatrice Levy, a wealthy couple who have their own Judaica collection. And here we see the order of the Seder. Moss intensively studied text and artistic traditions for 3 years before creating his version of the Haggadah. And he incorporates Hebrew calligraphy, micrography, or the use of letters, symbols, or numbers to form an image, as well as reminiscences or influences from the art of paper cutting, which was an art form that originated among yeshiva students who needed a pastime to do something between their studies of Torah and Talmud. So now I have a whole slew of Seder plates to show you. This first one dates from 1480 and comes from Spain, and is the oldest known Seder plate in existence. Jews probably settled in Spain under the Roman Empire. They were frequently persecuted, but enjoyed sort of a renaissance after the Muslim conquest, when Christians, Jews, and Muslims lived peacefully together around 711. The 11th and 12th century were also known as the Golden Age of Jews in Spain, prior to the Inquisition. This plate has Hispano-Moresque decorations. The color and techniques are typical of lusterware pottery of the era. And this one is from Italy from 1673. It uses the technique of maiolica for its decoration. So maiolica pieces, and they are not just religious in use, but any type of pottery could be done in maiolica. Maiolica would have a pure white titanium base applied to it, and then color applied on top of that to give it rich and beautiful decoration. This one is from Germany from about 1764. And you'll notice that it is much different in its decoration and design. The copper or pewter base plate was probably made by a non-Jewish artist, as Jews were not allowed to be members of those guilds. But the decoration would be done by a Jewish artist, and you'll notice the Paschal lamb there in the center. This is known as the Exodus Seder plate and was made in Lvov in 1800. This is a city or a shtetl at that point in Galicia, so the Austro-Hungarian area, now part of Ukraine. The town was originally known as Lemberg and then Lvov, and is now known today in Ukrainian as Lviv. The illustration is from an Amsterdam Haggadah. The 10 plagues are depicted around the rim. And the process for creating this image was that process of repoussé, or projecting the image by hammering forward from the back to create a low or bas relief. This Seder set was made in Poland in the late 18th, early 19th century. Rampant lions stand with mouths opening, holding cartouches, and they convey robust energy which with those cartouches, which bear the blessings recited over the symbolic food. Grillwork echoes the lion's curves and their notched paws. And you'll notice that the receptacles for the matzah at the bottom are round. We also have a crown-shaped place for the cup of wine for Elijah. And this is a Viennese Seder set from 1815. In the 19th century, affluent Viennese Jews had a 3-tiered Seder plate like this one. The 3 tiers hold the 3 ceremonial matzahs, and small rings on the outer rail held a curtain around the plate, which of course is now missing. The eagle-shaped feet support the plate, and ceremonial food containers are made up of complete figures bearing vessels. Moses is the largest and stands prominently in the center of the plate. He balances a holder for the cup of Elijah on his head. 3-dimensional human figures in Jewish ceremonial art are unusual, and many thought that this type of figure violated the second commandment against graven images. However, Rabbi Sofer, who was around in the late 18th and early 19th century, said that such figures were not objects of worship. And so he reasoned that their dress established their identities clearly. A curiosity of the dress is that some figures have on slave loincloths, while the females are in classical dress, and 2 men are shown in contemporary clothing. This is another example from Vienna from 1900, a little later. Blue and white flowering vines and birds are traditional folk images, along with the 6-pointed Star of David. The segments may have been intended for the symbolic foods. And this Seder set is circa 1920s from Jerusalem and was made at the Bezalel Academy of Art. The school was named in honor of Bezalel, the first artist in the Bible. God endowed him with many artistic skills. The form and Haggadah quotation specifically states its function. Each overall indentation holds one of the ritual foods, and the raised center holds a cup of wine. The quotation on the rim give the order of the Seder, and in the center we see the verse, next year in Jerusalem. This tiered Seder plate and Elijah cup were made by Friedrich Adler in the early 20th century. And you may notice now the compartments for the 3 matzahs are square rather than circular. Traditional motifs and contemporary forms influence ritual objects. The cup of Elijah was uncommon prior to the 20th century. The artist Friedrich Adler lived from 1870 to 1942 and trained at the Academy of Arts and Crafts in Munich. Initially, he worked in the Jugendstil, or German Art Nouveau idiom. but later shifted to grid-like designs and sharp geometric motifs. So the Bauhaus was founded by Walter Gropius in 1919, and it aimed for well-designed objects with simple forms. These objects could be mass-produced while also reflecting individual fine craftsmanship. The Bauhaus aesthetic was form follows function, and decoration was to be kept to a minimum. Another example of Bauhaus design is this Ludwig Seder set by Ludwig Wilpert, made in 1930. The main idea here, of course, is that form follows function and ornamentation is kept to a minimum. The set is based on earlier lavishly decorated Passover large table centerpieces, and Wilpert combined the visual effect for the essential function. This Seder set is quite different, however. It was made in Theresen in 1944. In 1938, there were 122,000 Jews in Czech lands. In the next 3 years, 26,000 immigrated to various places. Approximately 74,000 were sent to Theresen, which had been established in October of 1941. Theresen, or Theresienstadt, was a medieval fortress town in Bohemia, and the Nazis designated this site for the Jews of Bohemia and Moravia. Some privileged, famous, or elderly Jews also were sent there, and the Nazis concealed this, used it to help conceal the systematic extermination of Europe's Jews. Theresen was a transfer point before going to the extermination camps. In 1944, a Red Cross team investigated there and found nothing going on, although all of the activity was being hidden. The German inscription on this wooden Seder plate says the Jewish Youth Movement to the Jewish Council of Elders, Theresienstadt, April 3rd, 1944. Making Haroset is the subject of this still life painting made by Toby Fluch in 1975. Haroset is the delicious holiday treat served only at the Passover Seder and symbolizes the mortar used by enslaved Jews. Fluch was born near Lvov, Poland. Her family was forced to Brody, a city in the Ukraine, during World War II, and she was the only one she lost 2 sisters and a brother and her father in the Holocaust. Noble met her husband, Max Fluch, in a displaced persons camp, and they immigrated to America, and Toby took up painting in her spare time. So when I look at this image, the one thing that comes to my mind when I look at the nuts, apples, and wine is that my father, who was quite the wine connoisseur, always made sure we had a bottle of Manischewitz Concord grape in the house because he said that was the only wine that made the Haroset taste the way it was supposed to taste. Carrie Feldman made this Seder plate in 1987. It is highly stylized and made of glass. Each of the images or symbols on the plate refers to a different one of the ritual foods. So we have the bricks where the Haroset would go. And then going around, we see the little lines that get smaller and smaller to represent the Exodus. The spiral image representing the wandering in the desert, the sunburst representing the receipt of the 10 Commandments, and then we have the open egg, which symbolizes new beginnings. This Seder plate is titled From Slavery to Freedom and was made by Lorelei and Alex Gruss in 1990. They are a husband and wife creative team who use fine woods and beautiful inlay materials to create wonderful Judaica, and they are still living and working in New York today. The images around this drum-like shape show images from the Exodus as well as images from World War II. I have 2 goblets to show you. This first one is a Passover goblet from Warsaw from the 18th century, and it may have been used as a cup for Elijah. Those teardrop shapes that decorate the outside are depictions of the 10 plagues. And this cup of Elijah was made by Michael Schwartz in 1989. The Hebrew lettering is a design element for the cup, and the inscription contains more than 700 letters cut by hand and they represent a Zemer or song dedicated to the prophet Elijah. This painting, made in 1993 by Adam Ralston, is given the title Untitled from the Matzah Box series. And many of you may have an idea of who Ralston was inspired by when he created this. So what could be more familiar and endearing than a box of matzah? It is much like the icon of Campbell's soup cans of Andy Warhol, who indeed was Ralston's inspiration. It is similar to the pop art images from that era of the 1960s. However, a postmodern artist adds irony to the image. At first glance, this looks like a normal everyday matzah box, like the matzah box from the supermarket. But closer inspection shows that it is larger than life. As a matter of fact, it is 72 inches by 72 inches. We also see places where the paint is dripping over toward the left, especially we see these little white drips. And the word American, the white does not completely cover the red behind it. Of course, there are no boxes of Manischewitz matzah that say American across the front. So Ralston is making a comment about the commercialization of a ritual food here in America. So prior to the mass production of matzah and Americans who were non-Jewish getting a taste for it, you didn't see matzah in the stores all year long. You only saw it during Passover. But the folks at Manischewitz and many of the other matzah producing companies have learned that there is a market for this food all year round. And so they make matzah that is available all year round, as well as matzah that is kosher for Passover. And we will end today by looking at examples of the Maxwell House Coffee Company's Haggadot. So Passover Seder ends with the words, "Next year in Jerusalem." And you'll notice there is a wine stain on the page here to the left. One of my audience members pointed that out to me the other day. So I wish you all Chag Sameach and happy Passover. It is said that the love of art cannot be taught, it can only be caught. And I hope we've made the art of Passover contagious to all of you today. In closing, I just wanted to let you all know that Jewish art education has a wealth of programs available. And I apologize, that slide should not say ask your activity director. That was the slide that I use when I give this presentation at senior living communities. But you can visit us at www.jarted.org or just Google Jewish Art Education to find our website. We are also on Facebook and Instagram. And we have programs on individual artists as well as holidays like today's program, as well as thematic programs. So if you visit our website, you can find out more about our program catalog. So I'm going to stop the share. And I would be happy to entertain any questions or comments that anyone has.
Fabulous. Oh my goodness, Nancy. On behalf of our in-person audience and our at-home virtual audience, what a rich presentation. Oh my goodness. So many different beautiful works of art, different media, so much history. Nancy, this is such a wonderful way for us to welcome Passover and learn about some art at the same time. On behalf of all of our audiences, and the Miles Nadell JCC community, I just want to thank you and JAE so much for all of the research and all of the knowledge that you've shared with us today. So please join me if you're on Zoom or if you're in our home in-person audience in a well-deserved round of applause for Nancy Kotz. Just fabulous. So we have time for some questions, and Deanna, who is hosting our Zoom room, is just messaging me. Thank you so much. We've got like multitasking people everywhere. So I'm going to read the question on behalf of Susan, and then Nancy, you can feel free to answer. So Susan is asking, I'm not clear on the quote, no graven images rule. Many of these documents include people's faces. Do these count? Have the rules changed? And are there multiple interpretations?
That is a really good question. So the second commandment, of course, is a prohibition against graven images. And throughout the centuries, the Jewish community has wrestled with this idea in terms of visual representation in art. But as I noted, there were several instances in which a rabbi in a particular place at a particular time made exceptions to the graven images rule based on the depictions that were being illustrated. So, for example, in the Bird's Head Haggadah, which was from the 13th century, the rabbi indicated that the images of figures in the Bird's Head Haggadah were not to be labeled as graven because they were not made for the purposes of idolatry. So that purpose of idolatry really is the thing that determines whether or not an image is graven. So you will, if you remember from reading Exodus, that Moses got very disheartened when he found a group of the Israelites who had built a golden calf. This was considered an idol because they were worshiping it instead of worshiping the Almighty, the one true God. So the other passage that gets pointed to quite often is a passage in the Torah that speaks about Bezalel. And Bezalel, whose name was given to the Art Academy in Jerusalem, which I mentioned several times, was the first artisan mentioned in the Bible. And he was commended for his skill in all manner of workmanship. And we even have a passage that Bezalel was responsible for decorating the hem of the priest's robe with images of pomegranates and other of the 7 species of Israel. So because Bezalel is mentioned in the Bible, many Jewish religious scholars also point to that as the delineation on that second commandment against graven images. As long as the images weren't made as a focal point of worship, i.e. a god, like, say, the Egyptian figures of Akhenaten and those kinds of figures, then the depiction of figures in works of art were permitted. I hope that answers the question.
I think that was a very comprehensive answer and a great question from our Zoom audience. So we have a question from our in-person audience, and I just encourage you, if you have any questions, you can raise your hand. And if you're in the Zoom room, you can either chat them or you can raise your hand the old-fashioned way, and Deanna can help you unmute. So here's a question, Nancy. So the medieval Haggadot. So you mentioned sometimes about the commissioning of them. And so who had the money to print these and commission these? And on average, how many of each of these illuminated medieval manuscripts might have been printed? And how might they have been distributed, or how could you have purchased them or accessed them? They're so magnificent.
They are. I'm not quite sure the number is that were printed. That's a bit of a hard question to answer. Certainly after the printing press was invented in the 1400s, the mid 14 to late 1400s, the production of the printing process and the production of multiple copies certainly got easier. When you have pieces like those in the Rothschild Miscellany or some of these others, generally those were commissioned by someone in the upper echelons of the community, and were not made in multiple copies. So the Sarajevo Haggah or the Rothschild Miscellany Haggadot were probably not something that would have been mass produced, like say that image, the example from Prague that I showed a little later. The production of these books was quite expensive. They were not something that were made for your average Jewish resident of your average shtetl. They were pieces that were made for wealthy merchants or elders of the Jewish community and that kind of thing.
Okay, fabulous. I actually have a question, if I may. So when I was looking at the Rabin painting, beautiful, that's the Israeli artist, and that's actually the image that we used in our marketing. Thank you for sending that, Nancy. Very, very impactful. So when I looked at it, I thought immediately of Modigliani. Just some of the colors and like the way that the faces were depicted a bit. And I just wondered if he was inspired. Like, do you know if he was inspired by Modigliani or any other artists?
You know, that's the first time I've ever had someone mention Modigliani, which is very interesting. When I think about that image, I kind of think about the same thing. Certainly Modigliani would have been known by Rubens. Modigliani died in the early part of the 20th century. He did not have a very long life. I'm actually going to be giving a program on him tomorrow for AJCC in Vancouver. So really appropriate question to ask. Modigliani certainly would have been known, especially because he went to from Italy to Paris to study, and he spent the majority of his adult life in Paris. So I would imagine that Rubin probably had seen Modigliani.
Okay, thank you. I love that you're doing a presentation for our sister JCC out in Vancouver. Does anybody? Yes. This is an interesting question. So we have a question. Were any of these pieces of art produced in a miniature format so that they could be seen in a different way? It's an unusual question.
That is an unusual question, and I don't know the answer to that question. I have seen some book facsimiles of a couple of the Haggadot. The Birds had Haggadah in a large format printing, and the Golden Haggadah, I think, was reprinted in a small format. Several years ago, I had an audience member at one of my in-person presentations of this program who had a copy that he brought with him to the program of the Golden Haggadah, which he shared with me, and it was beautifully done in a little slipcase. But that would be something I'd have to research a little bit more.
Great question, Dave. So many of the beautiful pieces that you shared in your presentation resonated. I'm sure that different pieces resonated, with different people. One that stood out for me in particular, just because my grandparents were survivors, was that I can't get over it. The Seder plate from Theresen. I'm gonna need to take time to I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about how they even had the wherewithal, ability, materials. You hear about these amazing stories all the time about what they were able to produce in the camps. And then the second one that I'll just share, because before I do my closing remarks, that struck a chord with me and reminded me of something that I use at my family Seder. I was really, really struck by the 3-tiered Seder plates. I had actually never seen anything like that before. I don't know if our in-person or at-home audience have any of those. They were remarkable, but I will tell you that a few years back, my mother received as a gift from a friend who lives in Israel, and she gifted it to me. I'm pretty sure it's made out of silver, and it is this magnificent, I guess like a glorified Elijah's cup and Kiddush cup. And what it is it's not tiered the way that you showed with the entire Seder plate and the matzot, but what it is it's tiered, and it's kind of like a cascading fountain made out of silver. And at the top is a cup about this big, and all of it is etched on the outside, and it looks like buildings that you might find in like Jerusalem. And the top,
Oh, wonderful.
it's gorgeous. And the top is what I presume what we use is Eliyahu's cup. And
Mhm.
then all the way around are these teeny tiny little silver Kiddush cups. And you pour the wine or the grape juice into the top, and it cascades down, and it
Oh, how
fills up.
wonderful.
I have to tell you, my daughter, the very first time that we used it, like she was just in awe of this. And anyhow, those tiered Seder plates that you showed us, it reminded me of that. So I just wanted to share that. So
Oh,
Nancy,
sure.
you
I would love to see a photo of that, actually.
I'm gonna have to send it to you. Absolutely. What's the question? You can take the cups out, all of them. You drink from them. So the idea is,
Oh, that's amazing.
it is really spectacular. I'll take a picture of it. I will. I'm getting requests for, I'm going to have to post it. Absolutely. So these were really such treasures. You've got us, I think, so excited. Those of us who celebrate Passover, those who are interested in art history, the ties into the Last Supper. So I think that there's so much rich symbolism and beautiful art to appreciate here. So again, on behalf of everybody, Nancy, thank you so much to you and to JAE for bringing us this wonderful pre-Passover lecture. Really, we're so grateful to you. So
you're very welcome. It was my pleasure.
Very nice. I just wanted to make an invitation for those of you who are either a virtual audience or those of you who are able to come to our building in 2 weeks, the afternoon of Thursday, April the 20th. We have a British guest speaker, Alexandra Epps. She's marvelous. She's from Tate Modern and Tate Britain, and she is giving a multi-access lecture about influential Jewish artist Tamara de Lempicka. She became an icon of the Roaring Twenties. If you take a look at the promotion, you will, I'm very sure, instantly recognize her artwork. It's extremely iconic. And starting on Monday, May the 1st, CBC radio host and Globe and Mail critic Robert Harris is returning with a 3-part multi-access series, Beethoven, the Bible, and symphonic spirituality. I have all sorts of other programs coming for spring. Some are in person, some are just virtual, some are hybrid like we were today. For more information about these or any other adult daytime programs, please watch for announcements in our e-newsletters. For those of you who are in our room, you can pick up flyers at the back on your way out. You're also always welcome to email me, lisar@mnjcc.org. I think wonderful Deanna, our Zoom host, is going to type that in the chat for our virtual audience. So as always, it is always wonderful connecting with all of you today. For those of you who are celebrating Easter soon, I wish you a happy Easter. For those of you who will be celebrating Passover, I wish you a Chag Sameach and a good Yontev, and I look forward to seeing you again soon, either in person or virtually at the Miles Nadal JCC.